Yo, it is that time again. Power ranking season. Obviously, the CDL Kickoff Classic was this weekend, so we have a ton to break down today, and this is the first official power rankings of the Vanguard season. The event was dope, and we learned a lot about these teams with a lot more questions also. So we'll be going through all of that today. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's go. Alrighty, so obviously this is the kickoff event. We learned a lot about some of the teams, a little bit about some others. Some teams only played one match and ended up heading home. But the event, of course, was on LAN, and this was the first time that we saw a lot of these teams ever play control, or at least from their point of view. At the least, we maybe seen them play control against Boston scrimming, but nonetheless, we're learning so much about those teams in that game mode specifically. And then also in S&D, we haven't seen any of these teams play S&D since like the kickoff tournaments back in November. So there was so much to dig into and learn from this event, which is why it was so dope, but also why it's incredibly difficult to power rank. So at the end of the day, this is the first one of the year. We'll be tweaking with this as the year goes along, but nonetheless, I'm still really pumped about actually getting these rankings in here. So this is the power rankings template. We got the needs work category, the in the mix category, contender, and elite. We'll try to aim for 2, 3, or 4 in every single category is our goal. So I decided to actually pre-order them. So we'll actually start from the left side here in the needs work category. Off the rip, let's talk about the Paris Legion. There's some really interesting things here. I mean, they've lost against LA Thieves 3-1. They won a Gavutu control against LA Thieves, which is a really solid win, especially considering how we saw LA Thieves play later in control in this tournament. But the thing that really worried me about their performance specifically was in the Tuscan hardpoint against LA Thieves, where they were just getting outslayed. They were legitimately just straight up losing gunfights at times. It didn't seem that they could keep up. They lost like 250 to 138. And some of the mistakes they were making, gunfights they were losing, seemed like these things might stem from deeper issues with the squad than just on the surface that might take more time to fix. That's why they're in the needs work category. More and more potential as we move forward to become a contender or, you know, eventually find themselves in that elite category. But Paris still has a ways to go before they get to that point in the season. So I had a lot of debate here on where I should rank these guys at number 11 and number 10 or number 9. But at number 11 right now, we got the London Royal Ravens. This new roster, of course, with the debuts of Nasty and Gizmo, pairing them with the rookie last year, Afro, the sophomore now, with the veteran Zero. And in their one match, they played against Seattle, they lost 3-0. So after their match right there, I was like, oh no, this is bad sign. You know, Seattle's a new team, they beat them 3-0, but with Seattle's success, obviously, it makes the 3-0 feel not as bad because both the Tuscan Hardpoint and the Berlin S&D were really competitive maps, but we got to see more of those flashes of brilliance from Afro in the S&D on Berlin, but we're still waiting to see a little bit more from Zero, especially inside the respawns. And then Gizmo and Nasty, I don't think we got to see their full potential yet as players. So they definitely fit into this needs work category because they're still developing, but man, I really think there's still upside potential with this roster in the long term. So I'm excited to learn a lot more about this squad once we head into stage 1 here and actually get some real matches. Because again, we only got to see one series and only 3 maps and only 1 map per game mode. And like what I was talking about at the beginning, that's such little information to go off of, where who knows, maybe they lost a Berlin S&D, but they would have won a bow cage. Maybe they lost a Tuscan control, but they would have won a Gavutu. You know, who knows? Those are always these things with these matches. And so we're nitpicking off of one map in one match against one team and extrapolating from there. There's still so many things that could go on, because one moment specifically in the hard points that they really lost track of Mac, and he was going rogue and winning rotations. And so I guess that's something to watch for moving forward about how they track names, to keep track of positioning around the map, awareness and tracking kill feeds, identifying where these missing players are moving forward. So I think overall it's safe to say they right now fit into the needs work category, and it might take a little bit of time for them to get into that top 5, top 6 type conversation. But I think the opportunity is still absolutely there for this squad. LA Gorillas here at number 10, which is insane to say with how talented of a roster this is of Slasher, Hook, Asim, and Gunless. They lost 3-1 to Florida in the one match they played. There was a lot of chaos. I mean, that first match was the first match of the whole event. The bow cage hardpoint went down to the wire 250, 246. So it was back and forth. So I think it's a little bit unfair to probably have them in the needs work category, because they're definitely better than this. And historically, slashers teams notoriously start slow. If you just took a screenshot of this list and saw LAG, you know, here sitting in the needs work category, in the long term, they're going to be fine. I don't think it's worth overreacting to a loss against Florida, who showed a lot of promise. We'll talk about them in a little bit as well. We saw a Hook that looked very, very good. We saw Classic Hook, a guy who was really good at getting first bloods, would sometimes get first blooded a little bit too much and go a little bit too rogue, but was also very good at getting those important kills. He was very good at rotating early and playing for map control. And ASEM, we saw him have his huge moment inside the control where he was dominating, and that was the exciting ASEM we were hoping to see coming from New York last year to this team. So there's still a lot of potential here with this squad, but I think it might take some time for them as well to get going here and become even more and more competitive. So I would expect to see this team start hitting their stride by the end of stage 1. So it is important to watch out for them heading into that stage 1 major and see how they perform throughout the stage. Alrighty, so now we're into the in the mix tier here. And again, this is so tough. There's some really competitive teams here. And realistically, at this point, this early in the year with this little information that we have about any of these squads, it's still possible that any of these teams, and even like I said, I would say even London and Grills would fit into that category, could make runs like what Seattle did. Number 9, which is insane, is the Minnesota Rocker. I want to also reveal that the next team as well, because I was going back and forth with how they wanted to perform here. The Boston Breach here are at number 8. The X factor here is that they had a similar opponent. They both played the New York Subliners. The Rocker got 3-0'd by the Subliners. Boston took them to a 3-2. And overall looked significantly more competitive in those matches, even though the Rockers 3-0 was a very competitive series, because they lost that hard point on Bocage 250 to 242 when they completely outslayed the Subliners. And like that was the match where Attach and Major Maniac were absolutely frying. And ironically, Major Maniac had the highest KD of the whole tournament, even though they lost 3-0. But they definitely showed their potential and slaying power there. So it's insane that they're at number 9, and it goes to show the competitive nature of the league right now, where there quite literally are upwards of 10 teams that could potentially be in the grand finals on any given week right now, which is crazy. It was interesting to see Attach sniping on Desert Siege and doing that, and then the control went down to the wire on Tuscan in a 3-2. So I have no problem with somebody having the Rocker higher, but right now I think that Boston Breach with these young guys, and they've looked so good in scrims as well. With Boston, we only saw them play again that one series against the New York Subliners, and they got smoked in that first map on Bocage by NYSL. And again, Krim and Clay were turning back the clock a little bit. We'll talk about that in a second as well. What I really liked about this team and the potential we saw for them was how Nero was playing in Search and Destroy. I loved his ratty and fast plays to create map positioning, play in odd angles, and really push up the map to create control. They clutched around 11 on Tuscan versus NYSL. I was a little bit confused about how they played the control on Gavutu. They really let NYSL manipulate the spawns and didn't really identify them and try to push out to create more balance. So I was a little bit surprised to see that. But overall, again, first event where you're seeing control, those types of things are going to happen. And then, of course, in map 4, Capsule awoke and had the insane moment on Berlin. And so that's what you get excited about from their perspective, is what Capsule and Nero could bring to the table. And then on Berlin Game 5, they end up getting smoked in the S&D. But overall, I think they have a lot of potential in S&D, and they would definitely look very competitive inside the hard points too. So I think there's a lot to be liking about this Boston Breach squad moving forward. So now at number 7, we got the Florida Mutineers, and they played 2 matches. They beat LAG 3-1 like we talked about earlier. Then they end up losing to Toronto 3-1. And we saw the skies that we were hoping to see, man. In that first match against LAG, he was flexing this year, so he had the SMG out on Bocage, and he was absolutely cooking on the Bocage hardpoint, which was dope. And then we saw Dave Patty in his debut on LAN looking really good as kind of an S&D first blood beast on Berlin, specifically opening up that map for bomb rotations and opening up a lot of map control for them. They won both their S&Ds, which were both Berlin S&Ds, against LAG and against Toronto. And that was the Sky's finger game where he got his finger cut. And we actually had our first injury timeout in CDL history or whatever. They didn't look very good in control. Toronto had their way with them in that Tuscan 3-0, got body bagged in that one. And then they were smoked in Berlin. And we, first saw how good Toronto could be on Berlin there. Overall, seeing Dave Patty do what he did in S&D, and we know how good Skies and Vivid and Awakening can be inside Respawn, I think this team showed a lot of potential upside here moving forward. When you have a potential game mode like S&D to bounce back on and fall back on, you got to feel at least pretty good about this team as a team that can make some noise in the next few weeks in stage 1. All right, next on the list here is the New York Subliners, and we're now inside the contenders tier for top 6. So it's crazy again that the Subliners are at number 6 here, but they won 2 matches. They beat Boston 3-2, then they beat the Rocker 3-0, ended up losing to Seattle 3-1. So I had a tough debate here as some of these squads and where New York would end up. Number 6 felt about right for them. They were flying against Boston. I mean, good to see Clay and Krim come out to dominate. I mean, Krim on that bow cage went 38 and 28 and was absolutely frying. They outslayed Boston by like 22 kills in that match. So they were looking really, really good with slaying upside, especially on a map like bow cage, where you might think that like a Clay or a Krim would prefer playing on a different map like Gavutu or a Tuscan or something like that. So seeing them fry on bow cage was exciting to say the least. And then Krim's first bloods were coming through again. Like last year, we talked about so much about Krim's first blood ability. Like in stage 4 last year, he had the highest first blood win percentage of any player in the season. Again, this year was finding those first bloods with nades, with the automaton. He looked really, really good. Clay was, again, when those listen-ins, was really commanding the troops. Even in those moments where they weren't slaying, like in that Rocker match where they got completely outslayed, but still won the map because of 2 important crucial breaks in the bow cage hardpoint. Like that can just completely change the game. So they have that potential to do as well, where even when they're not slaying, they can still win. You see them playing like on Desert Siege and how they're playing. I don't know, man. It gets me pretty pumped because there's no doubt in my mind that this roster could absolutely win a stage at some point this season. Alrighty, next up, we got OpTic Texas here. My goodness, it is hard to figure out what this team is. I have them above New York, even though New York won 2 matches. Like definitely the debate would be whether or not them or the Subliners should be higher, because of course the Subliners beat the Rocker 3-0 in that second round and then ended up losing to the Surge 3-1 in the semifinals, whereas OpTic in the second round just got to play that 1 match against LA Thieves, then lost. And of course, the series was insanely close, even though it was a 3-1. Man, did Scump start off slow on Gavutu, to say the least. And so that the slaying power was surprising, even though they looked so good on Gavutu in their scrims before they stopped streaming them. So a lot of people were excited to see that Gavutu was on the map for him, or on the map rotation for him in the series. And then they end up losing it. And then the biggest surprise was how uncoordinated and messy the S&Ds looked. I mean, on Desert Siege Dash, he was left in like, what, 3 1v4s? And I was really surprised they didn't let Brandon ever try to snipe, because he was playing the island role on Desert Siege, where he was on the one side of the map kind of by himself. And so I was surprised that Illy was the one sniping, even though he probably should have been playing with Scump and Shotzi a little bit more up towards the map and pushing up a little bit for more map control. I don't think they were very good at Desert Siege or very prepared to play Desert Siege, and it definitely came back to bite them. I mean, and not to mention LA Thieves had already had some reps going, especially on Desert Siege. They'd beat Paris, I think it was like 6-1. And we saw a lot of the day 1 teams end up winning their day 2 matches, like where we saw Surge beat FaZe. We saw the Subliners beat the Rocker, and we now saw Thieves beat OpTic. So these teams who won in the first day ended up winning the second day. Toronto was the only one that stopped the Mutineers, which I think overall makes sense considering Toronto and Mutineers history. There might be something to the fact that playing on day 1 was at least somewhat advantageous heading into day 2. Long story short, OpTic in New York played like a 7-game series right now. I think OpTic would win. It's obviously really hard to say. And again, we only saw 4 maps from OpTic. But long story short, I think OpTic's going to be just fine moving forward, but I don't think you can put them in the elite tier right now with some of the other teams who finished here inside the top 4 at this event. So speaking of the top 4, LA Thieves is at number 4 here. Again, they beat Paris 3-1, then they beat OpTic 3-1, then they lost in an insanely close match to Toronto. And every single player on that team had their moment to shine in that series, whether it was Envoy against Paris on Tuscan, or Draza and Kenny versus OpTic, or Draza in that Toronto control where he absolutely dominated, and Octane in the S&Ds and his sniping on Desert Siege. Like all of those moments were really cool to see for them. And it was exciting to see the LA Thieves roster live up to the hype, where I was a little bit concerned about this roster early on in scrims from the results we were seeing. But again, I think we all underestimated the potential this team has in Search and Destroy, and they were obviously very competitive in Control as well, and Draza shined there for sure. And then of course, not to mention how close they were to beating Toronto in that series. Obviously, they lost 250 to 248 in what will end up being probably one of the craziest hard points of the whole season in the kickoff event. LA Thieves debatably choked that map away. They had every reason to win it. Toronto definitely clutched up, to say the least. Obviously, there's also the smoke GAs, and things can change with the meta as well, with Simp roasting Draza about the smoke usages and stuff. So we'll see. But I like this LA Thieves teams moving forward, to say the least. Alrighty, so here at number 3, this might be controversial because of the results we just saw. But again, I'm going to put the Surge at number 3 and FaZe at number 2. People might be screaming up in arms. Obviously, Surge just beat FaZe 3-1 in a crazy impressive series, to say the least. I'm hard pressed to be able to say that if FaZe and Surge replayed a best of 7 series or a double elimination beat them twice situation, I'd be hard pressed to commit to FaZe losing to Surge or Surge beating FaZe. The Surge played insane, and Sib and Pred proved that they are going to be the real deal. But the question is what they did sustainable in a tournament where teams were just seeing them play Control and S&D for the first time? And there's a lot of variables there, and Surge are probably the team that will have the most varied opinions on in the COD community, depending on what you think about their performances. They looked good in Search and Destroy, and they looked very good in Control. Toronto was the first team to beat them in Control in a round. Until then, they were 9-0 and heading into the grand finals. So they have a lot going for them. They were definitely ahead of the meta, and probably even S&D in this game as well. Just like in games in the past, we've seen teams dominate early and then take steps back. Think of like TK in World War II. So there is a world where this team could see some major regression. I don't see them falling outside the top 6, at least not quickly. We'll have to see how teams react to Pred and to Sib. They look like the real deal to me, and that's why they're sitting here at number 3 in the power rankings. Sib looks like a true flex, and we definitely saw the value of having true flexes in this game with teams who have a guy who's very, very good with an SMG in hand and can switch up the pace inside of Search and Destroy, can play on bow cage and be very competitive. When it comes to Pred specifically, I think he's a true bloodborne slayer, and we saw him pushing out the map, especially on Gavutu against FaZe, where we saw Pred push out, slaying in their spawn, looking like literally an elite slayer against the defending COD champions. And we saw Mac even in that first series or two look fantastic as well. And so this team has so much potential to be very good in the mainstay. I just think FaZe is probably going to rebound in a pretty big way. And so let's talk about FaZe real quick. Usually when great teams get embarrassed, they're going to bounce back. I mean, Simp screenshot it. I mean, my word, I don't know if we're ever going to see this again. He had the second worst KD at the whole event, a 0.82 in the one series they played, which was only better than zeros. FaZe is going to be just fine. We saw their slaying potential about how much they dominated Seattle in that first map on bow cage, literally taking them to the woodshed. So I fully expect FaZe to bounce back and be just fine moving forward. So now let's talk about the Toronto Ultra. My goodness, there were some questions about this team, and they answered every single one of those questions. I mean, their S&D is still elite. We got to see Cammy sniping again, which was awesome. Throwback to Modern Warfare, Cammy on Piccadilly. In Control, oh, shocker. They're really, really good at Control. Didn't skip a step from last year being the second best Control team in the CDL, only behind FaZe. And then inside of Hardpoint, Benjamin Bance came to answer every single question we had. I mean, did you see him on that Berlin against Surge? It was his map. He dominated. And like when you see Kleenex dominating in Control like he did with how good they looked in the S&Ds on Berlin and Bow Cage and on Tuscan against Seattle, they only lost to Florida on Berlin. And again, Berlin was the map that Florida looked really, really good on in both of their series. Overall, I think Toronto is locked and loaded. Shocker, they're still really good. So there it is, guys. Power rankings, the first power rankings of the Vanguard season. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you guys did, we have a podcast coming out tomorrow. Check out my last video right here, and you can check out the gaming channel as well, where gameplay just went live today. So there's a lot to look forward to, and I'll talk to you guys very soon. Peace.